Hello, and welcome to the Babies in Common Show. I'm Jeanette.
And I'm Melissa. Welcome, listeners. As a reminder, everything said in this show should not be taken as medical advice. Please consult your own healthcare provider for questions about you or your baby's health and visit babiesincommon.com/disclaimer to read more.
Awesome. So today is Wednesday, September 2nd, 2020, and we're here discussing queer parenting with postpartum doula and trainer Rachel Hess. Rachel is a CAPA-trained postpartum doula who's deeply committed to improving the lives of children and families in the greater Boston area. She works individually with new families, leads parent support groups, and is an experienced trainer and facilitator within the perinatal community. She's presented on the topic of supporting LGBTQ/T, which is a different acronym, and she'll explain why, families for various perinatal professional conferences, and has supported new families for more than 10 years in the Boston area, where she lives with her wife and their 2 children. Thanks for joining us today, Rachel. So cool to have you. I've known you for a little while here.
Cool. Thanks for
Fun to
having
get you on.
me. I know, it's very exciting.
Awesome. So sorry, let's do it again. I'm just gonna say this again. LGBT, because that's a different way of wording it. I'm so used to the typical acronym that rolls off my tongue a little bit more. So LGBT is the way that you like to say parenting, refers to lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people raising one or more children as parents or foster care parents. And this includes children raised by same-sex couples, otherwise known as same-sex parenting, children raised by single LGBT parents, and children raised by an opposite-sex couple where at least one partner is LGBT. And LGBT people can become parents through various means, including current or former relationships, co-parenting, adoption, foster care, donor insemination, reciprocal IVF, and surrogacy. And these are all wonderful ways in which children can be welcomed into a family, but for the purposes of this episode, we'll be focusing mainly on LGBTQ families that become families through through pregnancy and birth. Awesome.
Yes, it's truly wonderful that so many lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and other queer people are parents. In the 2000 U.S. Census, for example, 33% of female same-sex couple households and 22% of male same-sex couple households reported at least one child under the age of 18 living in their home. And according to a 2015 report, between 2 million and 3.7 million children under the age of 18 have a queer parent, and approximately 200,000 of them are being raised by a same-sex couple. And I definitely look forward to the 2020 census data because I bet those numbers are growing as technology, laws, and cultural attitudes evolve. So why don't you kick us off, Rachel, with talking about some of these acronyms, LGBTQ plus, LGBTQ/T, queer. Can you, talk to us about what these acronyms mean, why you prefer to say LGBTQ/T, the word queer, what that encompasses, and all of that. So let's start with the alphabet soup, if you will.
We have how long? No, I'm kidding. So this is such a great question. I mean, so one of the things, so the reason I use the backslash is because, this acronym defines a community that is very diverse, and it defines a community that includes someone's sexual identity as well as someone's gender identity. And, a lot of the times when I sort of talk with providers about this, there's sort of this question of like, well, why is it all together? And I think there's like a lot of different reasons. There is really a shared history and shared oppression that both people sort of in marginalized sexual identities as well as marginalized gender identities have, and at the same time, there's a lot of sort of like, there's plenty of gay men are pretty transphobic and all of those kinds of things. So it's having the backslash really separates sexuality from gender. And I think it's also a good reminder to us that someone could be trans and identify as straight. They could be in a relationship with someone of the opposite sex, and like that happens all the time. And so I think within the community and also for people who work with queer families, it's important to like not muddy those two things, even though the layers of it and the history behind all of it and like the really cool, beautiful ways that our community has invented ourselves and redefined ourselves and expressed ourselves is really nuanced and layered and complicated. Um, so that's sort of part of why I think it's important to differentiate those things a little bit. Um, and then also queer, which is like one of my favorite things to talk about, just that word generally. Um, you know, that's a term that was a slang, or sorry, not a slang, a slur. That's the word I'm looking for. And still is, I think, can be often. And it's been reclaimed by members of the community. And, you know, I think what's really beautiful about queer is it does not have a very specific definition. It depends on who you ask. And it is a word that could apply to either sexuality or gender or both, which I think is really cool. You know, I always say that, like, for me, it's that I am in a same-sex marriage, but and raise my kids in a same-sex household. And also it's about my politics. It's about my kids are little activists and go to Black Lives Matter marches. It's believing that we should end systems of oppression for everyone. It's that my gender and my sexuality are pretty fluid. Like, it means like a lot of things in a way that feels really freeing to me, and I think for a lot of people. But it's one of those words where, like, you could ask 10 queers on the street what the word queer is, and you would get a different answer from all of them. So I think it's, you know, that's part of what I like about it, right? But I do tend to say that it's a word that's like an insider word. I mean, this is one of those things that's changing, right? Like, and debatable, but like, I think it, you know, it's like one of those things where, like, people should always have the chance to self-identify, right? And so queer is a word that is really shifting in the world. And, you know, the acronym is sort of like the go-to for providers to use to sort of define this big group of people. That was a very long answer to your question, but that's
an important answer. Yeah, I mean, because, you know, I have a friend that I grew up with that we both grew up pretty Catholic, and Catholic Church has a big homophobia problem, and they now identify as pansexual and gender non-binary. Okay. And so that's kind of a mouthful too, right? Because pansexual is like, I love the person for who they are, not what their sexual or gender identity is, and right. and gender non-binary is you know, very open and fluid. And so the word queer kind of to me you know, makes sense when I'm thinking about my friend, because there's so much in that, right? That it's just, you know, that but my friend does not like that word, because that word was used as a slur, like growing up, oh my God, that's so queer. So, you know, you're so queer. And so it's interesting, because obviously I am going to take their lead. Like you said, as far as self-identifying, I am not a queer parent, and so I'm not part of that community, and but it's just interesting, because sometimes the fact that queer doesn't have a definition is actually exactly why people like it. You know?
Right, and that's how I feel about it personally, and also I totally understand why for some people it doesn't feel specific enough or like concrete enough, right? So yeah, no, everyone totally has. And also, I mean, I was not bullied with that word as a kid, right? And my wife grew up Catholic, but I was raised by hippies, so like I don't like there is cultural baggage around a lot of those things.
Sure,
like,
absolutely.
I didn't experience. I mean, and this is one of those things where, like, when you're in a room, it's very like when how old you are matters in terms of your feelings about that word. And I would say probably the younger you get, the more people use the word queer. And, you know, I've definitely talked to like older lesbian and gay people who are like, whoa, I would not use that word, right? So, you know, that's just, I mean, language is ever evolving, you know, no matter what the community context, right? So
yeah.
So for today's episode, we're going to probably kind of interchange LGBTQ and queer, and we mean that in the most accepting and loving and compassionate way.
Totally. I love that. That works for me.
Awesome.
I love that.
Awesome. So you had mentioned oppression, and so we know that queer families, as you would call it, face discrimination and oppression in our society, even still in
Mm-hmm.
2020.
Oh, yeah.
And so, what are some of the examples that you can give from your experience and your knowledge in this area about families when they're getting pregnant, growing a baby, planning their birth, postpartum, parenting? So, sort of that whole journey of that perinatal period. What are people facing
Yeah.
that is similar to people who are considering themselves heterosexual, and
Right.
what things are like, so what are the same, and then what are some of the big differences?
Right. Well, I mean, it's interesting because I think there is sort of generally a frustrating sense across the board that like there's still a lot of work that needs to be done to empower people who are pregnant, empower new parents. I just talked to a mom today who was trying to get help with like with thrush actually, and she tried calling her OB, and her takeaway from it was like, now that the baby's not inside me anymore, they just don't care. I was like, that's real.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
That's real. Doesn't matter if you're gay or straight. That's
Right. Exactly.
um, so like I think there's just a lot of work to be done to empower, yeah, people who are growing babies generally. I think that there's a couple different ways that homophobia and transphobia manifest for queer parents in particular. And I think one of the things that I always talk about with families is like, there's like really systematic levels of oppression. Like it says mom and dad on every single hospital form, or the birth certificate, right? Depending on where you are. Or even just like if you're gender non-binary and all the bathrooms are, man side, woman side, right? So those are like really on a more systemic level. But then it also looks like not, I don't want to say passive aggressive, but there's sort of the interpersonal oppression that can be really blunt and homophobic and outright. And I would say more commonly what I experience with families, especially sort of in the Boston area, is a little more kind of covert and subtle forms of oppression. So things like, your partner comes with you to your prenatal appointment or comes with you in the hospital, and like everyone calls them your sister, even though you've like corrected them multiple times, right? So it's like not seeing and validating who you are. Um, I often tell the story of the childbirth class that my wife and I took a million years ago, when I was pregnant. And so like another way that it can look is being like excluded in that like you're the only queer people in spaces, right? So childbirth class, breastfeeding class, new parent group, right? And for us that manifested in the instructor like kept saying things like dads and partners and dads, and then like one time was like dads and my wife's name, because like they couldn't like wrap their head around like just saying partner instead, because like they have not practiced or experienced that before. And so that was really hard for us obviously in our learning. So those are some of the big ways. I think then too there's this piece around like I mean this is something I talk a lot with queer parents about, like how to respond to, is like asking inappropriate questions. And I say that with a lot of pause, because I think that depending on who you are and like what your role is with a new family, like it's not that, like I love talking about our donor and I love talking about my ridiculously long birth and blah blah blah, but like if I feel safe, right? And I think there's sort of a feeling, I mean it's not unsimilar to how people go up to a pregnant person in a grocery store and like touch them, right? It's sort of this feeling of like that like all knowledge is accessible to everyone.
Right. Like, oh, so where'd you get the sperm from? Like,
Exactly.
none of your
Who
business.
wants to have a baby? That's so curious, right? Right. Again, like I think people have different feelings about how to talk about it, but or how whether or not they want to ask those questions. It's not like they're off limits, but often the ways that people ask about it is very loaded with assumptions and loaded in homophobia and transphobia and all of that. And so coming up with clever answers for those things can be really fun. And I would say like the other thing that sort of related to that queer parents often experience is sort of this, and again, this is one of those things where like if you're a step parent or an adoptive parent, like all of these things are relevant to that, but sort of this feeling that if you're not violent, like who's the real mom is a question that's asked.
Sure.
And so like there's an assumption behind that like biology is the most important thing, which it's not. It's real, but it's not the most important thing. And like those, and like how when you live in a society where like the vice president actually wants to take your kids from you, or that's my based on many things, like there's like a lot of violence almost in that question, right? It's sort of like your family isn't real or valid, or you're not a parent that will be recognized legally potentially, right? So it's not just a innocent question, right?
Well, also the fact that you have to, if you haven't given birth to that child, then you have to adopt that child.
Oh yeah, that's okay.
Oh, maddening.
It's really fun. Well, actually, technically what you do is the birth parent gives up the right to the baby for 5 seconds so that you can both adopt together. It's like this really insane process, or that's what it was like when we did it.
Wow.
Yeah, but so like that's a question that like, is seemingly very innocent, but because of the homophobic structure we live in, it like has all this like loaded, which I don't actually find the question of like, oh, like, did one of you carry this baby? Who? Like that to me is maybe still inappropriate depending on who you are, but like, that's a reasonable question. Like I love talking about that. But the idea of like someone being the real mom, right, is very problematic.
Which is really stupid anyway, because like my parents got divorced when I was 3, and they both remarried heterosexual. Like my mom remarried my stepdad, my dad remarried my stepmom when I was like 6 or 7. And, this was a theme in my childhood too. Like when they would say like, well, draw your family, and I would draw 2 moms and 2 dads, and they would be like, well, who's your real dad? And I was like, well, that's an interesting question, because my biological father doesn't ever come around, but my stepfather is raising me. So, we really should be past this. Like we should be past saying that, biology is what's important. Who's the real mom? Who's the real dad? Like it's just so lame. It's so lame. I mean, I always felt very lucky growing up because of my different family. Most of my other friends did not have divorced parents. I was pretty much one of the only kids with divorced parents back in, the 80s and early 90s. But I had like multiple sets of grandparents, and I even had people that I called grandparents or aunts and uncles that were not biologically even my grandparents or my aunts and uncles. They were my mom's best friend. And so why can't we get over this?
Well, it's also that like, Rachel, you live in Boston. And it's a very progressive, it's one of the most progressive areas in the entire nation.
Right.
And to still be experiencing that in such a progressive place is still like, wow, how much further does so many other areas of our country have to go?
Oh, I mean, yes, totally. But also like, I mean, it's interesting because I think, one of the things we talked about, or that were sort of in your questions, was like, what should queer families be looking for, and how do you know if a provider is actually like LGBTQ friendly? And there's this way in which, like I think people in Boston are often like surprised and disappointed that they have these experiences, right? And there's also a narrative, I think, around like, what does it actually mean to be queer friendly? Like I don't even like that term, and like, because friendly, like I don't need you to be friendly with me.
Mm-hmm.
To like not oppress me, right? Like, and I think that sometimes there's this idea that, oh, because we live in Boston, then I put a rainbow sticker on my door, that therefore I'm gay friendly. And a lot of the language around that is like tolerance. I mean, the thing that I really like to say about this is like, I don't really want you to tolerate me. I actually sort of think I'm better than you because I'm queer. And so like that needs to be like recognized and celebrated. And like, this piece of like, no one should ever have to like check a piece of themselves at the door. And so, right, like it's not just that I'm queer, but I'm a cis woman and I'm from California and I'm middle class. And like, if I were a person of color or, from somewhere else, like that would be part of what someone might bring into the room. And like all of that, the way that someone experiences the medical system in particular is all of those things, right? It's not just like, oh, you can have a wife, that's cool. I'm like, well, that's not really the point. And from where I sit anyway. So
No, but even just like your little examples, it clearly is saying like either you or someone you know have experienced like kind of comments like that, you know, which
oh, for
is like,
sure, yeah.
yeah, crazy. Yeah. So
Oh,
what have you seen like birth wise, like in how they're treated and or postpartum by care providers as well as society, like little anecdotes or anything you can encourage providers who are listening to this, but
right.
also encourage random people
Yeah.
in how they talk to people.
Yeah, I mean, so I think, I gave a couple examples of like, misidentifying families, right? Like I think there's like with any family, right? Like I mean, these examples too apply a lot to single parents, right? Like the assumption that where's your husband,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or I always tell the story about one time I was being interviewed by a couple, and they were talking about like going who was pregnant, and it was a straight couple, and they were talking about going on a trip, and I was like, oh, was that your honeymoon? And they were like, we're not married, and I was like, oh, I totally made this up. These nice straight people were totally married, right? So like all of that kind of stuff. I mean, I think in terms of birth and postpartum, the thing that I really like to highlight, both for parents and providers, is just like it is such a vulnerable time, right? I mean, the hours, days, etc., that you are in labor slash or having whatever birth experience you're having, that is, I mean, when else are you that vulnerable? Like maybe when you're born. But like it's so intense, and so that is the time when you need to feel. I mean, as birth doulas, or you need to feel the most safe. Um, and so what I really encourage parents to do is like when possible, like think about how can you make that space safe, knowing that especially if you're at a hospital, 25 residents could come into the room or whatever. Like who do you need at your side? What things do you need written up in your chart? Like how can you articulate, not assume that anyone's going to respect you, and like articulate what you need ahead of time. Probably good advice for everyone, right? um, and then in the postpartum it's a little different because in theory you're home and you like have a little more control of your space. But again, even like with pediatricians, lactation consultants, all of that, I just really encourage people to sort of not be apologetic about like who they are, who their family is, who they need in the room with them for any specific thing. I think that's the biggest thing too, is like if you need X, Y, or Z. I mean, I know COVID makes this dramatically more complicated, but if you need X, Y, or Z to feel safe, and this person can provide that for you, like how do you advocate for yourself to do that?
Yeah. You mentioned lactation, so I just had a really quick question. So one thing that I know is, I don't know, a theme or something we try to think about in the world of lactation is when you have two parents who might have the possibility of lactating. Is that becoming more and more? Like I've worked with two mom families, and mentioned that to the person who did not give birth to the baby, and sometimes they're like, "Oh yeah, I know about that. I'm not gonna try that." And the other one's like, "Oh, I never thought about it."
Right, totally.
Right? So is that becoming more common, or would you say it's still pretty rare? Like,
I mean,
what are you feeling or seeing?
yeah, I mean, again, I can only sort of speak anecdotally. I can
Sure.
probably count on one hand the number of folks that I know that have done that. I know a couple couples where like the non sort of birth parent did like non-nurturing
Mm-hmm.
breast nursing,
Nursing, right?
comfort sucking, like
Yeah.
whatever you want to call it. And I know one couple that did it because they knew that the birth parent wasn't going to be able to produce enough milk for some other reasons. But I think like when you look at like what's involved in inducing lactation prior to the baby being born. And like a lot of people don't think about it until after the baby's born, and then it's sort of like, well, this was like a whole thing that we should have done. And it's interesting because but also just sort of a feeling of like, well, that I don't need, like, what would be the reason, and sort of like, in families knowing that there are other ways to bond with the baby, right? I mean, so I gave birth to my oldest child, and my wife gave birth to our youngest, and we both nursed for a very long time. And I was actually still nursing my oldest when my youngest was born. But even in that context, we kind of talked about it, and we were sort of like, we felt pretty good about like, we're going to have different relationships with them in these special ways. And like, we both felt like that's going to be a thing that they do, and this is going to be a thing that me and my older daughter do. And that wasn't sort of like a need, like something that we needed. So I think it's very personal, certainly. I would say probably if it were very simple, more people would do it. Like, I think when people hear about sort of the process, they're kind of like, what? Like, what? Like, what? Why? Unless someone really wanted to,
Yeah.
That's sort of my 2 cents on it.
If anybody actually who is listening is interested in learning about inducing lactation, we did do a whole episode on that, Alyssa Schnell, episode 24. So definitely check that out.
So that's cool.
So let's talk about empowerment. We've talked a little bit about discrimination and oppression and barriers and microaggressions, but as a postpartum doula, how are you working with families to empower them?
Yeah, great question. Well, I mean, it's interesting because for me, one of the things I say is that, I have a queer lens, even no matter who I'm working with. And a big piece of that is around sort of, queer as a political identity and really empowering families, generally speaking. And so I feel like a lot of what I do is sort of coaching around that. I think, I am not a medical professional, but a lot of the times, people will come back from a pediatrician appointment or an OB appointment and say like, he sort of said this thing and I'm not sure about it. And, really encouraging families to like, well, if that didn't feel right, you call them back and like, what do you want to say? And like, a lot of the times I will talk to families before they go in for their like, they're not going in for as many now, but what I used to call 25 million pediatrician appointments in the first 12 weeks. And saying like, make sure you ask this question, make sure you ask that question, stuff like that. And so like that's a big piece of it, really like encouraging folks to both utilize their providers like how they want, like them dictating what it looks like and how it goes, as opposed to the other way around. And also, medical advice is medical advice, and also every person you come in contact with when you have a new baby will give you parenting advice. And so I really also encourage people to parse out what is medical advice and what is parenting advice, and sort of think about that. And I think, so like that's a big piece of it. I think too, just really, sometimes I ask people, when I meet them before their baby's born, like, do you have a parenting approach or philosophy? And usually people laugh at me. They're like, get the baby out, like that.
Yeah.
But like, I do think that that's a piece that is, I mean, having a newborn is not the same as having a 9-year-old who is basically a teenager. but that like helping people sort of identify that even in the early phases, I think is also a piece of like empowering parents. And, one of the things that I really do is, we live in a world where there's a little too much information, one might argue, about, I always tell people not to Google things. I'm sure you guys tell people not to Google things, especially not at 2:00 in the morning.
Yeah, that's never gonna help you sleep.
I literally just had a conversation with somebody, a client, who I was telling her some information, and I said, okay, well, I will send you information about that. And she said, okay, I'll look at that and then I'll Google it too. And I was like, please don't do that. I'm
exactly.
giving you good information that you can
Totally.
read. Like,
That you hired me for, right?
yeah.
Like that's why, right? Exactly. Anyway, um, but like I think one of the things that's hard about that information is like how do you tap into your like instinct and your gut? And so that's another piece too that I feel like I really work with families around. And I think with queer families in particular, unfortunately, one of the things that happens a lot is like a negative feeling or a feeling around um, like not worrying about bonding with the baby because of something that like a provider has said or something that a family member has said or something like that. And so I'm a really big what I call both and person where I think it's so any provider who's working with queer parents, it's really important to validate those experiences that people are telling you about, someone calling you the sister or someone saying, well, you're not the real mom, or like things like that, to validate like how much that sucks. And then also to remind folks like, but like, look, I saw the baby like sleep on you while you were doing skin to skin for 2 hours. And like, and like that's your baby doesn't care what those people say. Like your baby really loves you. And so I think it's like like with any parents, but especially with queer parents who are like having those interactions pretty regularly that are really invalidating of who they are as parents, like really encouraging them to like find that I keep going here, but like find that
Your
feeling
heart
that,
chakra. You're pointing to
yeah,
your heart
exactly,
chakra.
your heart feeling about your baby, and like that's the more important voice, not like the lady at the grocery store who like made some comment about your baby's sleep, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
because everyone has an opinion.
So I know that there for a long time has been like a certain group of providers at a certain clinic in the Boston area. And then there were like a couple more that I heard of that were considered, or they considered themselves, providers that served many people in the LGBTQ
Mhm.
group or community. And so, do you feel like it is typically a better idea for families to say, oh, who are those providers?
Interesting.
Or is it better for people to, like, sometimes there could be a provider who's awesome and lovely, and you don't need to go outside to that. So, like, how do
Right.
you suggest people find providers in that way? Because
That's
sometimes I
hard.
would imagine just like any person that I would work with, if they were unhappy with their care provider, I'd be like, well, here, a list of 5 people I know are really great,
Yeah, totally.
right?
Yeah, right. I mean, and I think this goes back to that thing of like, um, you know, the rainbow sticker is not as important as like you feeling heard and validated, one might argue. Um, and I do think, I mean, it's interesting. You were talking, Melissa, earlier about that thing of like, I have aunties who I wasn't even technically biologically related to. Like, if it's one thing queers are good at, it's like having extended family networks and being hooked in. So like like it's when I think about queer families I've worked with, unless they're like brand new to the area, they're like hooked into like that provider did that thing. I'm gonna go over here. Like I mean, I think obviously there's institutions and stuff to find that information in, but um I do think that like even when you're interviewing a pediatrician, when you're interviewing a midwife or a OBGYN, escaped me for a minute. I think it's like what's that say? It's like that same thing of like what's your gut feeling when you're
Mm-hmm.
this, and even if they have that sticker, if you're like I don't know, then that's like way more important um, than what like list they're on or what training they went to. One might argue, or I might
True.
argue.
You might argue. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I am not a queer expert in any way, shape, or form, but I am a birth expert, I would gather to say. And one thing that I definitely think is helpful is for all families, but especially in my experience, queer families, is a birth plan.
Yes.
Now, there's a problem with a lot of providers poo-pooing your birth plan, nurses, doctors, even midwives at times. But I have a story that's really interesting. When I was working in the Cambridge area, which arguably is a pretty progressive area, right? This is before I had my son. So this is pre 2012, probably around like 2011 ish. I met a pregnant trans man who was married to a woman at one of my childbirth classes. And so, I pulled them aside at one of the breaks and, was just kind of chit chatting with them. And, it was interesting is that nobody had told me that this couple was coming to my class. They didn't let me know that they were coming to the class. They didn't mention that they were trans. They appeared to be a heterosexual couple because the pregnant person had what looked, I thought, like just like a beer gut, and the cis woman was wearing a very baggy sweatshirt. And so and when they introduced themselves, the pregnant trans man stood up and introduced the couple, which I always say, like, partners introduce the couple. But then I split the group up into expectant parents and support people, and we talked about like what are the best and worst things about pregnancy from the perspective of a person who is pregnant versus a perspective of the person who's not pregnant. I didn't specifically gender it, and I didn't say dad's over here, but that couple got up to leave, and so
they got up to leave the room.
They got to leave the room.
Okay.
And so I went out to go to the bathroom because that's usually when I take a bathroom break. And I noticed that one of them was upset, and they were in the hallway and they were kind of talking. So, I was like, oh, can I help you? And the man was kind of stuttering and tripping over his words. And I'm like, and he was like, I don't think we can stay. And I don't think this class is right for us. And, I'm only like 12 minutes into class. Right. So I'm like kind of panicking, like, what could I have possibly said? Did I swear? Like what, and so then his wife said, you don't understand. He is trans. I didn't realize that you were going to be splitting the class up like that. It put us in a really awkward position. And I was like, whoa, okay, wait a second. This is not something I had anticipated. Fuck, I would have picked a different icebreaker. I would not have picked that icebreaker.
Yeah.
So I was like, okay, you know what? Thank you for the heads up. I am so sorry. I really hope you'll stay. I have other icebreakers to do. This won't be an issue again. Let's touch base though at lunch, right? So I ate lunch with them. They ended up staying there, having a good time. They never had to come out to anybody in the class because, I'm not saying that they should have, but it would have been nice for me to know so that I could have been accommodating. And then of course I'm tripping over my words the whole time. And, because I'm used to saying pregnant mama. And that's when, I adopted the term, I say like birth giver or pregnant person. I've since then tried to be more accommodating. But what was interesting to me was I was like, hey, so we were in lunch together. I'm like, so like, does anybody like on the L&D team know that you're coming? Because I worked like more than full time. And so I had not heard that we had someone who was trans that was going to be, and he was like, no, I just want to like, just get in and get out and get the baby out. And I was like, whoa, okay, let's chat about this though. Because like this, this is going to like really like, and it wasn't that I was saying like, you're different and this is going to be weird for us. It was, I want you to have a positive and empowering experience. And if you kind of walk onto this floor and there's been no preparation, and again, I understand that we're in Cambridge, but when I went back to that person's provider and I was like, hey, did you think you were going to give us a heads up about this? And they were like, oh, I really got around to it. I mean, it wasn't even going to cross the provider's mind to let anybody on L&D know. And so I actually ended up getting a conference together with the provider and the couple and me. And we talked about like, okay, stuff like you were saying, Rachel, like the birth certificate's going to say men and women. And that the birth certificate lady is going to have a conniption when she realizes like, I don't want that to happen. I want us to know what to do so that it's streamlined, right? You are identify as a man that is giving birth with a female, X chromosomes, right? So like, do you want us to check your cervix? Is there a better term that you like to use?
All of that.
Do you want to be asked whether or not you want to breast or chest feed? Like these are things. And so, it was funny because the doctor and the couple were kind of really like against this idea of a birth plan at first. Like, I just want to get in and get out. And I really had to like make my case like, I am not a queer expert, but I am a birth expert. And I support people through the birth experience, and I help them have positive and empowering experiences. And knowing things that make you happy, things that are going to upset you, trigger warnings, stuff like that, like, how you want to identify it, your body parts, like what would be, and it brought everybody's anxiety down, right? Because, the nurses, of course, were in this progressive, city. They're all like, well, if I say I have to check a cervix, like, what is he going to freak out on me? And I'm like, no, calm yourself. Like he, he said he has a cervix, he has a cervix. Like it's, check your cervix. Just don't ask him if he wants to breastfeed. He's already said he doesn't want to.
Right.
And so just like, so we wrote out a birth plan, and afterwards, we did chat, and he was like, wow, that was just went a lot smoother than I thought. And it was really helpful that we had that. And I really felt like you guys made a big effort. And so, I would definitely, not everybody is in that particular situation, of course, but
Right.
identifying who are the supportive people to you and how they're related to you. Just take the awkwardness out of it, because sometimes it is the sister, sometimes it's the person's mother, sometimes it's the doula, and you're like, hey, who's this person? It's nice to be like, right on your birth plan, like
Right.
my
So,
wife Rachel is gonna be with me.
well, I think what's so interesting about your story is, I think part of why you had like red flags go up is because the way that we talk about pregnancy, birth, families, babies is so uber gendered, like just
Right.
so incredibly gendered. So, like, sure, a body's a body and a baby's a baby, and you get them out how you get them out. But like, so much of the language around it is really, really feminized, but also just like, um, right. It's hard to move away from that, and I think that piece around being awkward around it is, so one of the things I tell providers when I do a training is I'm like, okay, if you've been teaching your child class the same way for 20 years and you say moms and dads all the time, that's fine. But you need to change it. And you need to not wait until you have a queer couple in your family, in your class, to change
Right.
it. And if that means you have to go stand in front of the mirror and say moms and partners or parents 25 times, then that's what you have to do, right? Because I think that sort of tripping over, I mean, everyone does it and we all make mistakes, but the idea that um, the sort of being flustered of like, oh, like this is the first time I've had a gay couple in my class, like that sucks for them
Yeah.
to be the first, right? And so like I really encourage people to change that language and practice ahead of time, because as I was saying at the beginning, one of the main ways that you know queer families sort of experience microaggressions and oppression is sort of by being the only ones in any given room, right?
Sure.
Anything you can do to alleviate that, or, I mean, they're still going to be, right? And like I was thinking when you tell that story, like, oh my God, the last place a trans man wants to be is in a group with a bunch of cis guys. Like,
Right.
geez, like, of course they ran out screaming, which is
Especially since it wasn't the shared experience, right?
right.
Because he was the one that was pregnant. So the whole
Right,
point of
totally.
the exercise
Oh,
was
right,
like,
totally
you know,
totally, right. Even worse, right? Right. So like the last place like a cis woman who maybe identifies as queer wants to be is with a bunch of cis guys, right? Like that was
right,
that's
right, exactly. Yeah.
anyway. So right. So I think right, like preemptively doing that, but also your point about the birth plan is so real. Like especially if there are pronouns that people
Right.
feel strongly about, like having stuff written out and then having a person, your doula, your sister, whoever, who is like being reminding people of the birth plan. Every new nurse that comes on, oh, that's the birth plan, right? What pronouns does everyone use? Like that kind of thing.
But also not even the pronouns, but like, what do you want your child to call you?
Right. Oh yeah,
You
totally.
know,
That's a
because
good
I
one.
see, and this really has bothered me for years, when, sorry, Melissa, but nurses in particular, they come in and they go, all right, mom, all right,
Oh yeah.
dad. And like the baby's not even out yet, and they're referring to this adult human who has a name, who is their client. They're like doing that. But then the baby comes out and they're like, okay, mom, do you want to do skin to skin with the baby? Okay,
Right.
dad. But like,
Right.
if you've got a same sex couple,
Right. Who's
which could
what?
easily be two men who just had a child via adoption and they're getting
Right.
ready, like the kid was just born, now they're getting ready to do skin on skin, to be
Right.
like, are you dad, are you daddy, like what do
Right.
you want to be, are you going to be called Jim, and like
Yeah.
two women, are you mom and mommy, are you
Right.
Mimi, are what are you, what do you want to be
Right.
called, and
Right.
just putting it out there like that, because not everybody who's in one case a female,
Right.
if they're the the other parent, the non-birthing parent, they may
Right.
not want to be called mom, or they might
Right.
want to all be called mom, but you
Right.
shouldn't be assuming they might even want to
Anything.
be called Joan or whatever their name is.
That is
And
true, but that
yeah.
is a tough one. So to me, I've heard. So I am a nurse. I've been a nurse for 14 years. I've heard queer activists say things like, "Don't ever," or even straight, "Don't ever call me mama. The only people that call me mama are my kids,"
Yeah.
right?
I do.
And they liken it to calling someone sweetie or honey, right? Which I don't, as a nurse, ever
Like,
call someone sweetie or honey.
yeah,
Rachel,
yeah.
Rachel, what did you just say?
Well, like that it's sort of like a talk down, like a
Diminutive, yeah,
patronage.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Right,
yeah,
right.
totally,
right.
totally. Well, and I think it's
However,
the language around birth is that, and that's
right.
right.
That's a whole other topic, right?
Right.
How we we
We don't have hours.
treat women like children in labor, for sure.
Yeah.
But then the other side of it is I know where a lot of those nurses are coming from, because
Right.
I often do this too, where it's like you want them to be excited that they are a mom or a dad, right? So like you're like, "Oh my God, you're gonna be a mom, like, look at you, daddy, holding the baby skin to skin." Like it's I don't disagree that we have to be mindful. We want to make people feel comfortable. For some people, that's going to make them feel great and awesome. Like, yeah, I love when my friends call me mom. I'm always like, "Hey, how you doing, mama?" Like, because we're all in this together, right? It's a shared experience between us. But not everybody feels that way, and so I do think that nurses in general have to touch base, like you said, Jeanette, like to talk to people the way that makes them feel the most comfortable. And not everybody wants, and so many times it is well meaning, but that's not always what's important. The other thing too is that sometimes people call you mama and dad because they don't remember your name, and I think
Right.
that nurses have to be better about that too. Like like you can't just, and I hear this a lot. There's a cultural thing too, like where I'll be giving report to somebody and I'll say, and that the dad's name is pronounced like Shruti, right? And the nurse will be like, "I'm just gonna call him dad." And I'm like, that's super dumb. Like, like his name is
Mhm.
Shruti. Like, like
Practice it.
try to
Yeah.
say that. Like, there's a
Rachel,
lot of
what are you
micro,
saying?
no.
Rachel's trying to
Well,
say
I
something and the
agree.
mic's
Like,
not picking
I
it
mean,
up.
I think all of that is totally valid, and I think also it's that thing of like, where I mean, there's that intersectional right of like, well, it's all tied into like racism too, and
Sure.
all of those things. And I think that you brought up that thing of like, um, I mean, this is something people who do sort of anti-oppression training talk about a lot of like intent versus impact, and that like when we, like I as a white person can say, oh, well, I didn't mean to be racist, but if someone who is a person of color said I was being racist, that's kind of the only thing that matters, right?
Right.
And that it's my job then to like learn from that experience as opposed to being defensive, right? And I think it's like a similar, I mean, it's not the same at all, but like sort of that idea of like, yes, many nurses, their intent is to have people excited about their baby, to help people, support people, to help them feel safe. But it's just one of those things where like the way we've been doing things for 50, 100, I don't know, when did hospitals become a thing? You know, like,
Like 120 years ago.
or whatever. Right? Yeah, exactly. It's a system that was created, to maintain all these systems of oppression. So like the idea of like talking to women like they're children, well, that's like not an accident, right? Like that's
Right.
a function of patriarchy, and calling a queer person by the wrong pronouns or like calling their wife their sister, right? Like it's not that individual person's intent to be homophobic, but like we do that to maintain heteronormativity, right?
Right.
And so I always really encourage providers to be, as non-defensive and like reflective as possible when someone, says something about a word they've used or a term they've used, because I think it's like, um, it's so important to be like, as someone who is in an oppressed group is telling me I did something wrong, I have to listen. But also B, when you're a nurse in that circumstance, like you have a lot of power in that situation, and like
Absolutely.
that's like a big piece of how someone hears what you're saying, right? Like yes, it's interpersonal, and also like you represent the hospital, right? And so like that's a big piece of it too.
And I
So
love that you're doing training workshops for professionals because along the same lines as you just said, it shouldn't be the job of people in an oppressed situation
Right.
or oppressed lives to be having to teach everybody all the time. That gets exhausting.
Right.
So to have professionals go, I need to get a workshop on this. Where can I find a workshop on this so that I can learn how, if I do encounter somebody in X group or Y group or whatever, that I have a better language around that and I know what I should say and what I shouldn't say. And it comes down to cultural competency for various groups that you're going to encounter.
Right. I mean, and one of the things I always say in my trainings is like, now is your time to ask all your questions that you're worried are offensive, because I will not be, I mean, I'm sure someone could say something that would be offensive, but usually it is that thing of like, it's a well-meaning question that's just sort of phrased a little awkwardly. And I'm like, ask me now while someone is paying me money to answer your questions. Like, you don't ask the person who's like transitioning during labor that question. Like, that is not the right time, right?
So how'd y'all get pregnant?
Yeah, exactly.
Not the moment to ask.
As you're pushing, who's the real mom?
Did you guys see a picture of your donor?
Yeah. Not so. These are things that are not what not to do in case you're just
anything else, Rachel. Things that we should not say, because I always like to have like really concrete suggestions when I go to workshops, and I get frustrated when there's not concrete examples. So any other like literal phrases or questions that really people should not be asking?
I mean, I don't actually have a good list. I mean, who's the real mom is sort of my go-to. Who's the dad is a good one. Or, you know, if it's a two-dad family, who's the mom is a good one, right? What are some other ones? I don't know. Those, I don't like have a bunch of like really straightforward ones, because I think it's so situationally dependent. But
I think another good strategy for providers is don't ask anything that's not medically important for you then and there, right? So,
well, that's such a good point though, because this comes up a lot with the when we talk about like the gender markers and sex versus gender. You know, gender is the construct and sex is sort of chromosomes, body parts, like that piece. And like, so a really good example would be like, we have talked to our pediatrician about our donor, because that, you know, he asked pretty early on, you know, are there any sort of history of this, and this, right? Like the same way you talk about like, yeah, my mom had breast cancer or like whatever, right? But we very early on told him, you know, he was like a little bit like, what's the right word to use? And so now he knows, right? And we talk about it that way, but like, that's a moment where, like that was a medical thing, like to know about my kid's genetic makeup. That was important. I can't really think of anyone else that would need to ask that question.
Right.
Like, who else needs to know that? Like, no, right? So like, I think you're right, like that point of like, sure, there might be things, right, that at medical professionals, we need to know about the sex in this way or that way, or hormones or something like that. But like, you know, just knowing it because someone is a patient or because someone is going to be in the hospital, or like why, like we ask gender and sex questions all the time for like why do you need to know my sex so I can get a driver's license? Like, why? It's because it's an assumption about how I'm going to look based on that marker, right? Like, so you can identify me, like you're asking about my eye color, but like not medically necessary, unless like some stereotypes about women being bad drivers is true. Like, you know what I mean? More like, not, and so like, I think it's really important for providers to be like, am I asking this out of habit, or like, is this like, why do I want to know this, right?
Sure. I think it's also fair to say, no matter who you are, if you have to ask a medical question about someone's donor, say donor instead of father, because that's a very loaded question, right? Too, like, we all know whether you're homosexual, heterosexual, pansexual, that sperm does not make a dad and an egg does not make a mom. We all. So, I mean, let's not even get into that. But so a lot of the people that listen to this podcast are parents. And so how can parents that are not queer parents acknowledge and welcome and be inclusive, not like, you know, like there's that person sitting alone on the bench, ask them to play, like we don't I don't want to other people, but like, how can you just, in the way that you act, in the way that you are, how can you just exude inclusivity as a parent?
With your crystals.
Yes, exactly, with all my crystals.
I mean, I think honestly, the most straightforward answer to that is just like not making assumptions about anyone's family structure or how anyone had their baby, just generally, which again, like this is helpful for single parents and
Sure.
adoptive parents, like all of that. I think like in general, we still as a society make a lot of assumptions. I mean, I did too, right, about that couple because I thought they were married. I'll make a lot of assumptions about who a family is. Like somehow we are still stuck in like 1950s nuclear family thinking. Um, and so I think like just really broadly, just not making assumptions about who is in anyone's family ever or where their baby came from. Is it like a pretty easy one?
I think that's a good one.
Yeah.
It's funny because like whenever I see, like I'm a talker, I got the gift to gab. And so when I'm at the playground, you know, if there's someone that doesn't obviously look like they're trying to avoid talking, you know, I try to strike up conversation. I've met some really amazing friends that way. And also, you know, sometimes you're only a friend for an afternoon, but you can commiserate over something about your children and, you know, get through the playground experience. So, you know, part of me wants to be like, if I see a couple that I have figured out through observation is, you know, they're smooching and then they're both smooching the kid. I can imagine that this is a same-sex couple, right? I want to be like, hey, I'm super cool with that. Like, can we talk and be friends? Like,
don't do that. Rachel says, don't do that.
You can't do that, right? So if I can't do that, because that would be ridiculous, like, I think, you know, there's a tendency, no matter if it's gender, sexuality, race, culture, to just kind of gravitate towards people that look and talk like you, right? And so, but we want to be, you know, inclusive without having to put a you know, a bumper sticker on our forehead, right? So is that, you know, any other ideas that you have, you know, just about being welcoming to you know, other families?
Yeah, I mean, so it's interesting because I when you sort of phrased it that way, it made me think of something that I always say, which is like, you know, a lot of the times we ourselves define ourselves as allies. Like I'm an ally to the LGBTQ community, or I'm a white ally in anti-racist justice. Um, and I really encourage people to, I mean, not just me, many people encourage people to think of allyship as an action, not an identity. So like, you know, when I do these trainings, I always say, you know, it's not like you take this training and then you get like a little ally badge, right? Like it's a constant learning process. So we can have moments of allyship where we are acting as allies, but then we have to do it the next time and the next time and the next time, right? And so like I would say like, you know, to that point of like it's super crappy to be like the queer person that has to always call out the homophobic thing that someone said. Like if you're a straight or cis person sitting in the room, like, and you call out the homophobic thing, that's like an act of allyship. And like, that's the way to be really, you know, culturally confident and really show that someone's full self is welcome, right? So like if you're on the playground and like a kid pushes another kid and says you're gay, right? Like being, well, I mean, that's debatable because like getting involved with other people's kids. So maybe like, don't do that. But like, you know, or someone makes an offhand like homophobic comment, like, and you know, you being the person to say, hey, that's not okay, as opposed to like the same-sex couple that's there having to do it. Like that to me is like the ultimate example of showing that you're cool with it. I think were your words. So
yeah. Awesome. I can think of one example. We were at the playground. So you said, you know, don't scold other people's children. I totally agree. Right. No, but so thinking of an example that I think illustrates your point, there was, I had these cars, we had these little Matchbox cars that my son wanted to bring into the playground. So I said, you know, if you bring in some Matchbox cars, you got to bring in a few because, you know, and share them with other kids that want to play. So this little girl comes over and she, you know, she's like, oh, can I have one to play? And they were racing them down the slide. And the dad said, oh, those cars are for boys. You know, you don't want to play with those, you know, and you know, this isn't obviously, he didn't call my son gay, but I said, well, that's silly, Asa. Isn't that hilarious? Of course girls can play with cars. And I really made a big hilarious deal out of it. And then the dad ended up taking his daughter away, probably because, I'm that weirdo liberal mom who lets girls play with cars. So no, but seriously, it was just kind of like, yeah, we have to speak up, right? If we're going to say that we're allies, we have to speak up. So that is a great piece of advice for sure.
And one might argue you have to speak up even when there aren't gay people there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or girls, or right?
Right. We were the only people in the playground.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think it's both. It's that showing, but it's also just like being a constant person who is in process to, end those forms of oppression.
Definitely. Yeah. Always, not just when people are looking, for sure.
Right.
Definitely.
Right. Exactly.
Awesome. So as we wrap up, any other wise words that you could share, Rachel? Anything we haven't touched on that you wanted to highlight?
I feel like we covered all of my talking points, if you will, all the things I like to talk about. No, I mean, I think the one other piece would sort of just be that I think for a lot of queer families, for everyone, new parenting is isolating. And I think that especially for queer families, it can be because, like I was talking about, we were the first in our sort of friend group to have kids. And that was really hard for me to sort of find community around it. And, people were supportive, but there's nothing like other parents to support you. And so I think finding your village is really important, and finding other queer families. I mean, sometimes it's nice when their kids are the same age, but not always required. Can be really helpful in navigating sort of all the things, especially when you get to school age and stuff around that. It's really intense.
Do you have any recommendations for ways that queer families can build their village? Because I think that's important for all parents. You got to find a village.
A great segue too.
Great segue. I am doing a queer parent support group it'll be on Zoom. It starts in a week and a half, September 14th, I believe. And so that's something that I've done before in real life. And it's always really fun it's like a combination of sort of talking about normal, the age range is, I don't know off the top of my head, which I should, but it's, 0 to, I think, 7 or 8 months. So we talk about normal baby stuff, sleep, eating, all the things, eating, sleep, eating. What else do new parents like to talk about?
Right. Poop. They also talk about poop.
Thank you. That's related to eating.
That's true.
But then also a lot of sort of commiserating around some of the things we've talked about today. And, there's sort of nothing like being with people who have had similar experiences to you in that time. So that's something that I'm doing. And there's a couple other doulas in the Boston area who are doing sort of pregnancy and postpartum groups for queer families. And I think that's a really good place to start, especially in COVID times, finding online groups that are supportive.
I haven't heard of a lot of those, so I need to also share that with people that I know across the nation too. Yeah, totally. Especially because it's on Zoom. It's a great way to connect. I remember years ago, back when we had Mothers and Company, I used to do a group called the Two Moms Brunch. And it was once a month-ish, or maybe once every other month or something like that. And because we had a bunch of two-mom families that had taken our classes, and so some of them would come to the breastfeeding support group we had, and we also had a new moms group that was not specific to feeding. And then I was like, well, let's get you all together. And they were like, that'd be awesome. And so it ended up being a great place for them to meet each other. Yeah, totally. And then I know there was one couple who I won't identify, not that I'm going to, I won't identify how I know them, but there's a couple that I know, and I was constantly talking about well, wouldn't you want to come to this? And they're like, no, we're fine. We don't need to know other gay people. Right. We're fine. We have our own friends. And they had a couple friends from their previous life before they ever had children who were also gay, and that was fine. But they didn't want to meet any new people, and it was just such a great reminder to me that not everybody has to rally around the same topic of who they are.
Totally. Right. No, totally. I have that experience too, where people are like, yeah, either way, and other people are like, please, I need this group, could be just queer families.
Yeah, and some
But right,
trans
everyone feels
people
like right, totally.
want to be with other trans people, and some people are like, dude, I like to consider myself a man now. I don't
Right,
need to talk to other
right,
trans men, you
totally,
know?
totally.
Yeah, yeah. It's
Totally.
just
So
everybody's
can
an
they find
individual.
that on your website,
Yes.
rachelhessdoula.com? So
Yep, that's it.
RACHELHESSDOULA.com. And since this is Zoom, it's anywhere around the country. I will say, if you're somebody that's thinking, I do not want to go on to do a support group at all, I don't ever definitely want to do it through Zoom. You don't even have to say anything. Just make it
Yeah.
a point, if you're pregnant and listening, to just to do one thing like that, one breastfeeding support group or a new parent support group or queer parent support group or anything, just to see how it is. Maybe it's horrible, you never have to do it again, but it probably won't be. It'll probably be something that you end up liking and connecting. And I think now more than ever, virtual relationships can be really important to make us not feel so isolated and alone, I think. So
Yeah.
thank you for running that group.
Yeah.
And thank you for being here.
Yeah, no, and I would just say about that piece, like I was really worried about doing groups on Zoom because I'm like a very, I'm an extrovert and I'm touchy-feely with consent, of course. And I have been really pleasantly surprised with how people feel so connected, even on the virtual platform.
Oh,
Like
good.
I had a whole screen of like crying new parents all but like because they feel safe enough to do that, and I think it's hard and it's not, I don't get to snuggle babies, which is like the worst thing in the world, but I agree with you. Like I would really encourage people to not be turned off by the platform and really try it. And because it's a man, is it an isolating time for everyone, and throwing a new baby, it's just pretty brutal. So not to use scare tactics, but oh my god, support group.
Yeah, it's really, really helpful.
Definitely. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thanks for having me.
So our next episode will air after September 10th. Sorry, it'll be our first Ask Us Anything episode, and our topic will be birth. So be sure to visit our Facebook and Instagram pages to post a comment with a question. I'm sure Jeanette will have a post up that we can all comment under. We'd love to hear from you.
Cool.
Awesome. And we hope you'll visit babiesincommon.com/show to view all our previous episodes and see what we have coming up. Our show is available, as you may already know, as a video recording and a podcast on our website, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. And if you enjoy the show, we really appreciate writing a positive review on social media or on iTunes, and visit our Facebook groups, our Facebook page, or our website to learn about the groups and classes that we provide, as well as lactation consults and feeding and bottle feeding consults as well. Remember that Babies in Common is a community for you. After all, we all have babies in common. So there we go. But thank you, Rachel.
Yes,
and
thank you so
I
much.
look forward to hearing more about your groups continuing on.
Thanks.
Thank
Yes.
you.
Good luck with your group. It starts, you said, September 15th?
14.
Awesome.
All right,
Cool.
great.
All right.
Take care.
Take care.
Thank you, everybody, for listening.